Hello, I'm David Kriebel. I am a professor at the University of Massachusetts in the United States, and I'm happy to be with you. I want to really first thank the organizers of this meeting, particularly Bruna De Marchi and Annibale Biggeri, and all of the others who made this possible. I hope I'm able to make a useful contribution for you today. And I also want to just note that I'm so sorry we're not all together in person in Firenze, and I hope that can happen soon. My work is as an epidemiologist, developing evidence on the hazards of technologies and chemicals, the effects on things like cancer. And as such, I have been involved in talking with, communicating these findings to the public, to citizen scientists, to policymakers. And I've been asked to think about and talk about the role of precaution in that work. So, is the idea of precaution useful in this post-normal science world in which I work, in which environmental health evidence is developed and debated and used or not used? And so first to set the context for that, just to remind you, this is the original beginning kind of the precautionary principle in environmental health, something called the Rio Declaration, 1992, where there is threat of serious or irreversible damage. The lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing measures preventing environmental degradation. This has been both cited frequently as an important milestone, but also it's been pointed out that it's a rather confusing statement. It has in it a triple negative. It's essentially saying not having evidence about a risk is not a reason for not acting preventively. Somewhat problematic to understand and turn into action. Its origin is generally accepted to be this German word, German concept for Sorgeprinzip. And I think if I had been asked 30 years ago, I might have proposed a different translation into English, maybe something like foresight principle rather than precaution. But precaution is what we have. A few years later in '98, a bunch of activists met in the United States and proposed a somewhat clearer statement, a definition. When an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. They, at Wingspread, laid out these four components. The first one really is the core, is that same idea, taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. But then they added three additional considerations or factors that one ought to shift the burden of proof to proponents of an activity, that one ought to explore a wide range of alternatives before taking a potentially harmful action, and that it was important to increase public participation in decision making. So the precautionary principle is intended to provide guidance in the kind of gray area between what's clearly safe and what's clearly hazardous. But I think it has been criticized, and I would say often appropriately, for being vague. When is the principle invoked, and which actions are appropriate to invoke precaution for? It's easy to criticize. Is shoot first and ask questions later an example of using the precautionary principle? Hopefully not, but it seems at first blush to fit that idea. Is it simply just the idea of better safe than sorry? Well, despite these challenges, I do think that it can be useful as a framing device for discussions with the public in the citizen scientist context, for example. Framing the question, the really deep and always an important question of how much evidence is enough before we take some particular action. And related is what I have observed another challenge in talking with the public about this question, how much evidence is enough, is the myth of certainty. I think that citizens and policymakers continue to believe, we could say to hope, that certainty is possible. And while people, as long as people hold out hope for certainty, it's very difficult to get them to acknowledge that we have to act in the absence of that certainty, in the face of uncertainty. So I think that in order to move towards accepting precautionary action, the public must become more comfortable that certainty is not attainable. And I'll get to this in a moment, but I actually think that this is in some way a small benefit of this terrible pandemic that we find ourselves in, because the public are seeing in very real time that we are being asked to do things that we understand. The evidence is not entirely clear for, because this virus is so new and so much is not known about it. I think that scientists have a responsibility, have a role to play in weakening this myth of certainty. I think we can do more to emphasize how little is known about many health and environmental hazards. And when we are more humble and acknowledging of uncertainties, I think there are a couple of benefits of that. One is a simple one, that if we say that there's a lot we don't know, it makes it easier to argue that more money is needed, more funding is needed to support research. But a little bit more practically, it also, this humility removes a major support under this myth that science can give clear and certain answers, as long as we just study it enough. Then there's a related misunderstanding that I have observed in my work with the public and citizen scientists. A related misunderstanding about how science gets to proof or to truth or to cause. It's often thought, I think, maybe implicitly, that knowledge just accumulates until a certain threshold is reached. And at that point, a risk is understood to be real or true. And of course, in the post-normal science world, we understand that this is not really the way it works, that instead knowledge accumulates, there is no threshold, different amounts of evidence justify different responses. Sometimes all we can say is, we just need to study this more, there's nothing we can do. And the use of some technology, for example, continues. Sometimes we can say, there's enough evidence of harm here that we ought to limit this technology, not ban it outright, not close it off completely, but perhaps limit it. And then sometimes we do, in fact, say there's enough hazard here, enough evidence of hazard here, that we should stop using some technology. Under this second model, as post-normal science scholars and activists like yourselves know very well, under this second model, the process really cannot be entirely conducted within the scientific community. The public, regulators, law, courts, judges are necessarily involved. And so we scientists need to speak to this broader audience and lay out, explain assumptions, choices of methods, all of which have implications for how much evidence these findings actually represent. So when do we know enough to act? Again, this basic deep question. Determination of sufficient evidence for action depends on context. It depends on things like the availability of alternative ways of achieving the same social good. It depends on the consequences of inaction or of acting in error. So I think that despite its vagueness, the precautionary principle can sometimes be useful as a way to focus attention on this deep question, when do we know enough to act? And a useful thing that I have seen is that it focuses attention on the fact that the status quo is not precautionary very often. So we've named this status quo as the reactionary principle, following the reactionary principle. And this is simply the standing the precautionary principle on its head. These are the four precautionary principle concepts rewritten, and see if they don't sound like the way we do things very often right now in our society. We require incontrovertible evidence of harm before taking preventive action. We place the burden on the public to show that each new technology is harmful. We don't consider the health or impacts of a new technology. Just put it out into the environment. And we discourage public participation in decision making. So when I have found that citizen scientists presented with this precaution versus reaction contrast are quite moved and quite energized. It makes it much clearer what precaution means by seeing what it's not, a sort of aha moment. I think that, as I mentioned before, the pandemic is also an opportunity in an ironic way to advance the public's understanding of the limits of science and of the need for precautionary action. Here's an article from a British magazine, The New Statesman, in April of this year, how coronavirus has led to the return of the precautionary principle. Pandemic is showing the value of caution as a guiding influence in government. There it is. This also from April. I was amazed to find online this article written by the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK. Not a body that I would normally think to look to for discussion of precaution, but here they are, applying the precautionary principle when the science is uncertain. And the Royal Society of Chemistry is taking lessons from the pandemic and saying, here are some lessons we have learned watching the unfolding of the pandemic and the scientific evidence for action to prevent spread of the virus. We've learned some lessons about effective science policy. It should be transparent, particularly about the limitations of the evidence. We should recognize that science is just one factor alongside social, economic, and ethical considerations. We need to be open to change. Very open-minded, very progressive lessons, and I very much agree, of course, that these are precautionary lessons. So I think that COVID-19 has made precaution an immediately relevant concept for the public. You know, we're being told, for example, to use safety practices like wearing a mask, social distancing, which are based on very limited evidence. And the public can see this. You know, is a face cloth effective at slowing the epidemic? Okay, we have to social distance, but is 1 meter enough? How about a half a meter? These are really important questions that we are dealing with every day in our lives. And the evidence is really not very strong. For example, for cloth face masks, the evidence that they reduce the spread of the virus is really very limited. But I think that they can be justified, they are justified by the precautionary principle. And admitting that the science is limited can reduce the risk of politicization when contradictory evidence emerges. If policymakers were humble and transparent in making recommendations about things like face coverings and say, we're appealing to the precautionary principle, I think it makes it harder then for that science to become politicized when we learn later that the evidence perhaps is not as strong as initially thought. So I think that COVID-19 has made precaution an immediately relevant concept for the public. And I wish that the public health authorities were listening to the Royal Society of Chemistry and invoking that principle. So looking ahead to the future, I think citizen science projects, the public will use the lessons of COVID-19 to form their views of the proper role of science and of precaution. Thank you very much.